Joining me now, he is a college football insider for Fox Sports and The Athletic, one of the best at what he does. It is Bruce Feldman. Bruce, thanks for coming on. How are you?
I'm doing well, Ari. Thank you for having me.
Yep, I appreciate you doing this. Obviously, a very, very busy time right now around not just the NFL, but especially in college, which is what you cover. I think I kind of have to start with the Jim Harbaugh news that you broke here. I mean, obviously the NFL is going to have several head coach openings like there are every year. I guess the question is, why now for Jim? Because this past year felt like the happiest he's ever been. Is it because, he finally has that win over Ohio State? Is it just the 12-month grind and no real offseason in college? What's the reason behind this potentially happening now?
Ari, the people I talked to both inside Michigan as well as in the NFL felt like this is a time right now where a bunch of circumstances have come together and why they think he's going to be very interested. First of all, as you mentioned, they slayed their dragon, arch rival Ohio State. They not only beat them, they whipped them in Ann Arbor. They go on to win the Big Ten title for the first time in almost 20 years, right? So I think on that standpoint, he has proven, because he had been pretty successful. The only thing he hadn't really done in a bunch of top 10 seasons, his winning percentage was actually quite good. The program was better than it had been in the previous decade, but they had just come up against and couldn't handle Ohio State. He fired his defense coordinator, Don Brown, who had done a terrific job for most of his career, and just it wasn't working. Well, then he shakes up the staff, has a much younger staff now. As you said, I think he did seem like he was much more comfortable. The football program really seemed in style like they were a lot more like the Stanford teams that were really physical when he turned that program completely around. And I think the timing of it is like, okay, we've accomplished this. I have checked this box. The ultimate competitor that Jim Harbaugh we've always heard. All right, now I've done that. I can't leave without beating Ohio State, much less win the Big Ten. Well, he's done those things now. As you said, college football is a big grind. It is not just recruiting all the time, but now you have the transfer portal. There's so much uncertainty. In the NFL, it is, yes, the hours are different during the week, but there's an off season. There's a real off season. There is no off season if you're a college football coach. Ask anybody who's actually been a college coach, and they will talk about some of the issues that go on in the off season. And that's really before the portal became a real challenge for them to navigate. So there's that. Then the other parts is on the NFL side is the place where he broke into as a coach was with the Raiders. He was a young quarterback coach after he finished playing. From what I'm told, he really has a good relationship with Mark Davis, the Raiders coach. Also, they have a really good quarterback. I mean, Derek Carr's not Aaron Rodgers, but he's as you know, it's not like there's all of a sudden, it's a franchise that desperately needs quarterback help. They're not the Carolina Panthers. So I think on that standpoint, it's attractive. He has some relationships with the Bears from his time there. He obviously knows Justin Fields' skill set because he coached against him and saw how good he could be. So I think there's a couple of intriguing options out there. We'll see what happens, because I would not at all be surprised now if he left at this point because of what he's accomplished. In fact, I think if you fast forward a year ago, even though a lot of people thought Jim Harbaugh wasn't going to make it, I think there's probably a better chance of him going now because now he has real options.
Yeah, the one thing with Harbaugh is he's kind of succeeded basically everywhere he's been, virtually also immediately, right? From San Diego, Stanford, the 49ers, just immediate success. And, you mentioned how he started his career with the Raiders, his coaching career with the Raiders. He had his playing career with the Bears, I believe, 7 years. Do you think there's been some back channel conversations with people upstairs in Chicago or Las Vegas with Harbaugh's camp? Because the reality of the NFL is that there's always conversations going on. People are always talking. Like the Jaguars had Doug Marrone last year, but we found out that they wanted Urban Meyer and there were talks happening. Do you think those conversations have happened with Jim Harbaugh?
I don't know, because Jim Harbaugh's, when I reported what I'd reported earlier in the week, I would glance at my Twitter timeline. People go, yeah, that's the agent. I'm like, I don't even know who Jim Harbaugh's agent is, right? Like, I think Jim Harbaugh, even going through this past year where they were redoing his contract, I don't think there was an agent involved. There's no Jimmy Sexton figure involved with Jim Harbaugh. So I don't know the answer to that. The other thing that I think is worth touching on here is as you said, Jim Harbaugh has had success wherever he's been, and usually it's happened fast. Jim Harbaugh also hasn't been anywhere for very long. This is by far the longest he's stayed anywhere as a head coach, right? Because, he did really well at San Diego, but he was only there 3 years. And then he went from Stanford, which was the worst Power 5 program when he took it over, their Power 6 at the time. Yeah. And then he got them into winning BCS Bowls and a top 5 team all within 4 years, but then he left. And he was only at the 49ers for 4 years. He took them to the Super Bowl, a lot of success, but left. Michigan's been the longest time. That is a long time for any coach, especially Jim Harbaugh, to stay in one spot.
Yeah, that's the interesting part about it, because it feels like everywhere he goes, it is 3-4 years and then he bounces somewhere else. And in Michigan, I felt like he was just waiting to get that win over Ohio State, and now he finally has it. So maybe now is the time to leave. And especially with those 2 openings that are going to be there, it definitely makes some sense, especially when you look at Chicago. And just, obviously they've struggled a lot, but look at some of the hires that City has made as of late. They had Joe Madden, they've had Tony La Russa, some big names coming back into the city. It feels like bringing in a Harbaugh to ignite the city would make a lot of sense. We'll see if that ends up happening, but it is something to keep an eye on as the weeks go on here. Let me shift over to a coach who made the college to NFL jump, and that's Matt Rhule, because there's been a lot of rumblings about him. Do you think that Matt Rhule is enjoying his time right now in the NFL, or is going back to college something that's been on his mind? Because I'm sure you've heard the rumblings, as many people have, but there's also an owner there that really wants to win, and so far it hasn't really worked out. What do you think is in Matt Rhule's mindset right now?
It's a great question. He did a remarkable job at Baylor. He could have been the head coach at Oregon. He took Baylor, which was a much bigger mess at the time for lots of reasons on and off the field. Did an amazing job. Could have probably, had his pick of some NFL opportunities. Really was sold on the Panthers situation. It has not gone well, as you know. I don't know if he looks there. I don't know. I've not heard this. This is something I've wondered, but I haven't heard it. Does he sit there and go, well, if Jim Harbaugh is going to leave Michigan behind, that's a really good job in the Big Ten footprint? Because, by the way, he is a Penn State guy. He grew up around the program. He played there. And James Franklin just signed a deal where James Franklin's not going anywhere. Penn State's not coming open. If you think about the jobs that Matt Rhule might be tempted by in college to come back, I would imagine Michigan's pretty high on the list. So if Jim Harbaugh leaves and that job comes open, if you're Matt Rhule, do you look at it and go, I don't have a quarterback right now. I probably have at best half a season or 1 year to get this fixed, if that. Do I leave money on the table? Do I try to, if it comes to Michigan being open, is that an ideal landing spot? Because if it doesn't work out here, it's 2 years. It's obviously been a real rough, it's not been like the Urban Meyer disaster, but it's obviously it's been a big uphill battle, and it doesn't seem like it's getting much better right now. So I think he's got to look at the landscape and go, okay, what are my options going to be now?
Yeah, the whole thing in Carolina has been it's been interesting to follow, because, they've made a bunch of draft picks on the defensive side. There's a lot of talent on that team. It's just the quarterback position that they've kept on failing. And they tried to get Stafford. They obviously tried to get Watson before everything blew up there. But it's the quarterback position that they're trying to figure out. And really the question for me has become really just ownership there, and the way there's so much urgency to win there, basically, and how much money they're throwing around, that it makes you wonder exactly what they'll do with Matt Rhule. We've seen, obviously, Matt Rhule, the way it's gone in Carolina. We saw what happened with Urban Meyer in Jacksonville. Do you think NFL teams are going to be more hesitant to go after college coaches who have never coached in the NFL before?
Yes. Especially the way you couch the last part of that. Coaches who've never been in the NFL before, because that's what Urban Meyer was. Now, Ryan Day, and I'm not saying Ryan Day is leaving this cycle, but Ryan Day has worked in the NFL. Ryan Day also is very hands-on with his system and his offense. Urban Meyer had not been hands-on with offensive football in a long time. Long time. And he also had never worked in the NFL. And I think sometimes when you get guys who have not been exposed to the NFL, they may have relationships with coaches because they've talked to them about their players over time. But I think when they're so, like in a lot of ways, Urban was kind of the exact opposite of, like you can see why it wouldn't have worked, because it's like, hey, he was so strong in his own beliefs of, well, I won 3 national titles this way, but it's a completely different landscape in the NFL. Whereas Harbaugh is different because obviously he was a really successful head coach in the NFL and he played there for a long time. I think the ones that are more interesting is a guy like Lincoln Riley, who's never been in the NFL, but you can see elements of his system that have translated into the NFL. And I think he's more in tune with players now. I mean, we see Cliff Kingsbury's had some success. Now, Cliff had played in the NFL, but he wasn't an assistant. Like a guy like Dave Aranda down the road. He spent a lot of time talking to NFL coaches, but he's never worked there. But I think Dave's relationship with players, and he is still hands-on. I mean, it's his defensive coordinator is actually running the defense, but I still think, there are guys out there who like, you know what, I could see him down the road being an option. But if you've never been there before, and if you're just see yourself as a culture guy or just as a recruiter, and that's what you pretty much do, I don't think it's going to translate at all. But, what you said initially is like, would this close off the pipeline? No, I still think there's probably going to be owners who are going to make really bad decisions, because a lot of these owners, like their fortunes are made not in football, in something else. So they think they know better. They're going to get, I think they're going to get seduced a little by the more ego, and that usually the more successful the college head coach, the bigger ego, the bigger persona he has. Dabo Swinney's never worked in the NFL. I don't think Dabo Swinney probably wants to be any part of the NFL, but I would imagine, I wouldn't think that would work, not because he's just like Urban, but I think there's some similar, he's a good recruiter. He's not really that hands-on in the system. And I think he's seen as a culture guy. And I think if you can't be in the conversations with your coordinators and really have a give and take in the NFL, and you don't have the relationship with your players and you don't grind on that, I think you're going to really, really struggle. I mean, because all these examples I've heard and talking to coaches in the postmortem of why it didn't work for Urban has been fascinating, and it's been pretty eye-opening.
Yeah, I want to throw out one more name in the coaching before we go to some players. What about Matt Campbell in Iowa? That's a name that has been talked about a lot in NFL circles. And there were some serious talks with like maybe the Jets could get him before they made their coaching switch last year. But like that's a name that has come up a lot. Do you foresee him being a potential guy in the NFL?
That one wouldn't shock me, because he's the guy, whenever you talk to him, he is way more substance over style. And he doesn't have any NFL connections, right? He never worked there. He's been a college guy. He's at Iowa State now, but mostly in programs that are a little off the radar. Now if Oklahoma State doesn't beat Oklahoma in the Bedlam game and Lincoln Riley is playing in the Big 12 title game, Lincoln Riley can't go out to go take the USC job when he did. Matt Campbell probably is the USC head coach at this point. Like they were all set to talk to him that same day. It didn't work out that way. And if you're an Iowa State fan, you got to be happy. Now, this year, they did not have a great season. A lot of people, including myself, thought they were going to be a playoff team. They finished 7-6, and they're going to have some good players move on to the NFL. So I don't know that they're going to be better next year, but he's a name. Look, if I'm Michigan and that job comes open, you definitely have to look at him. Right. I don't know what, because of he knows Urban Meyer from their time. They overlapped a little bit at a couple places briefly at Bowling Green. And I know Urban wanted to hire him at Ohio State, I think at one point, but I don't think there's a lot of similarities there. But the one similarity they do have is neither guy has NFL experience at all on their resume. And so I think that might be a tougher sell for an NFL owner now, because there's not a lot of cachet next. Urban at least had 3 national titles. Matt's coming off a 7-6 year.
Right. So that's just a name that has floated around. Obviously, after this year, I don't expect it to happen, but it's a name that has floated around in the past. Let's move on to some players here. And we all saw Caleb Williams enter the transfer portal. I just wanted to get your take on what is the consensus opinion on the new era of the transfer portal, along with the rise of NIL. I guess just how is NIL affecting the transfer portal right now? And how do, I guess, coaches and people around the game feel about it?
I think the coaches are unsettled because it messed up their power dynamic, right? So I think some, look, I worked with Urban Meyer back in 2020 at Fox, and I think the specter of NIL coming down the pipeline, I think was something that made him uncomfortable with the power structure it was going to be for college coaches. I think some other coaches are probably, you know what, like, it's different and it's fine. It's helping some players. And look, if we can use the NIL to our advantage, we're good with it, I think. Whereas, I think the transfer portal has been more of a, I don't want to say nuisance, but like more of a jolt to them than anything else, because there's so much uncertainty on how you can manage your roster. Guy has a good season and he can go in the portal. They always coaches for a long time have always worried a little bit about poaching of their players. Maybe a college coach who recruited a guy talks to the high school coach or talks to an uncle, and then all of a sudden, I may want to move on. Now there's a lot more fear of it. And I think because of that, especially if you're like even at a mid-major school, you may have a really good player. Like Wyoming plays in a bowl game. Their quarterback's a 6'5", 225-pound guy who can run and throw, puts up a huge day. He goes in the portal like the next day, and his receiver does too. It's like, and I'm not saying Josh Allen would have done this necessarily, but like there's plenty of guys who finished their careers at smaller schools where they might have been on somebody's radar and poached away. And now those things happen more and more, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's a different era, and I feel like some people have really just taken advantage of it, right? Like, I mean, Mel Tucker has done that. I mean, it's worked out great for him, but for others, I mean, it's very different in a way. It's kind of fun, obviously, but it's a new feeling and seeing like Caleb Williams go into it now, and he could still go back to Oklahoma, but that's a fascinating situation as well. I want to look ahead in a little bit here on a few topics. Michigan and Cincinnati were two programs who hadn't made a college football playoff in the past who made it this year. Are there a few programs out there, in your opinion, who could be next up in making that leap to a college football playoff?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to get too much of a read on like who's going to crack that ceiling. Like it depends on what happens where like certain guys go into the portal, it's like, I think there's still a couple of weeks before players have to decide if they're going to the NFL. Look, if you had told me who's a real dark horse that could make a playoff run, like kind of off the grid, a week ago, I might have said NC State. Their quarterback had a Devin Leary, 35 touchdowns, 5 picks, really good arm. They're probably going to have the best linebacking core in the country. Now, since then, they're losing their best receiver, Bam Knight, their best running back, and their best player, Ike Ekwonu, all going early to the NFL. So I think, some of those things, it's hard for some of these slightly off the grid programs to kind of break through, right? I mean, there could definitely be like another Michigan out there that's somebody who's like, has been top 15, but then all of a sudden all the pieces come together and they're able to make a run. But it's like off the top of my head, I honestly couldn't really give you one because, you look at the rosters of some of these teams and they're still so TBD, right? Just as we're, like an hour before we did this podcast, one of the most talented running backs in the country, Zach Evans, decides he's going to go to Ole Miss. Yeah. And that's a big get for Lane Kiffin, but we're going to see what else Lane Kiffin can add to his roster. I mean, I think for places like that, the school that I would say, and they're definitely not like a have versus have not, but like Texas A&M is putting in an epic recruiting class, right? Yeah. And Jimbo Fisher's getting Max Johnson. He's Brad Johnson's son. He's, by the way, beat A&M in the last regular season game when he was at LSU and basically beat them with half a team.
Yeah.
They have some really good players back. Now they're going to lose a bunch of good players on the defense. But if you ask me, who would I say if there's one team that hasn't been in the playoff that I think would make it next year, I'd probably guess Texas A&M.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. I want to hit on two players who have super bright futures. First of all, Jaxon Smith-Njigba, the Ohio State wide receiver. His Rose Bowl performance was just incredible. Over 340 yards, 3 touchdowns. Could you just like put into context just how special that performance was? And what do you think his ceiling is? Like, could he go as high as a Jamar Chase did at 5th overall just last year? Like, how high could this guy go once he's draft eligible, most likely in 2023?
All right. So before we get into that, we need to talk about like Brian Hartline is a guy who a lot of NFL fans will remember with the Dolphins, good player out of Ohio State. He has a receiver room that is insane. So the best receiver in the SEC, Jamison Williams, transferred to Alabama basically because he wasn't getting on the field at Ohio State because of Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave, who were really the two studs, and Jaxon Smith-Njigba was the third guy. The other two, Olave and Wilson, not opt out, but they put their names in the portal, put their names in the draft.
Yeah.
And so all of a sudden, and then there's Marvin Harrison Jr. and there's like 5 other guys behind it. But to see what he did, and he had been a really good player really for the last 2 years, talking to not just Hartline, but a couple other guys on that staff, they really raved about how tough he was and his ability to concentrate. I mean, Jamar Chase is that's a huge comp. We'll see if he can do some of those same things. But he has a big time quarterback. We saw, lost in those crazy numbers was CJ Stroud was just dropping dimes all over the place. And so, usually guys cannot be top 5 picks overall if they're a receiver, unless they're like Calvin Johnson-ish. Like Jamar Chase can obviously really run, but Jamar Chase is 6 feet, 205, 210. It's not like he's 6'4". And Jaxon Smith-Njigba is similar dimensions. Does he have the same toughness? I was around that LSU team when they won the national title a bunch, and he was different. I don't know. Like, to me, Jamar Chase is about as impressive a college receiver I've seen in the last 10 years, just because he was so strong. I mean, he went up against Derek Stingley Jr. every day at practice. And Derek Stingley Jr. is probably the most talented cornerback in the country. Whereas, Ohio State, it's not like they have that. But I don't know if I would, let's put it this way. It's an amazing, it's PlayStation numbers. I don't know. Is he going to be a top 10 pick a year from now? I'm pretty sure of that. Could he be another Jamar Chase? I would pump the brakes on that just a little, just because I think Jamar Chase was so special coming out of LSU.
Yeah, I mean, it's just amazing that Ohio State most likely has 2 first-round wide receivers this year, and you can make the argument that Njigba is better than both of those guys. So, I mean, just so much talent on that receiver room. The other player I wanted to mention here is, and you have an article up at The Athletic with a scouting report on Alabama, linebacker Will Anderson. I mean, he got some super high praise in that article. Could you talk about him and just go in depth on some of the things you've heard about him and his future?
Yeah, if he could be in the draft, he's not draft eligible. He's only been out of high school 2 years. He would be the first pick in the draft. I mean, as you mentioned in the story in The Athletic, I talked to 10 different coaches who faced Alabama this year. And if they had Heisman votes, Bryce Young isn't getting it. It's going to Will Anderson. They said, no disrespect to Aiden Hutchinson, this guy's way better. The thing that I think one of the O-line coaches I talked to who played him early in the season was like, I knew he was super explosive and had great get off. I had no idea how violent and how strong he was at the point of attack. Like, he's every bit as good against the run as he is against the pass. Another coach who had played against Myles Garrett said, with Myles Garrett, as dynamic and explosive as he was, you really felt like you could run against him. That's what you had to do. You can't do that against this guy because he's so good against the run. I mean, there's a crazy stat about Will Anderson. He leads the country in tackles for loss by like more than 10, but he actually has twice as many tackles for loss as anybody else in the SEC. I mean, the SEC is where there's more good edge rushers than any place in the country. And this guy is like the king of it. So you know, Georgia has a lot of great players on defense, but the best player on the field will be number 31 in Alabama.
Yeah, I mean, some of the quotes that you already mentioned, some of them, but like he's like Derek Thomas was one of them. He scares the heck out of you. He's unblockable. I mean, a lot of just super high praise for a guy who looks like he's built in a video game and has video game numbers as well. So again, he'll be draft eligible next year as well. I want to shift over to some quarterbacks here because, you know, we'll get into the 2022 draft class in a second, but one of the guys there is Kenny Pickett. And obviously he exploded this year. Who could be the next Kenny Pickett next year? Do you have your eyes on a specific quarterback who can make that type of a jump?
You know, I think that the challenge there, like, look, there's a guy who's going to replace him at Pitt, Keaton Slovis. He had some good moments early in his career, and then he battled some injuries. And look, they would have one good receiver, but there's a lot of dysfunction at USC. I don't think he has as much arm strength as Kenny Pickett does. He's not physically quite as big, but he's a very accurate, good passer. Again, I don't know if he would be that guy. I think there's a handful of other guys you may hear that are going to have a chance to really pop. Like, let's see what happens. Dylan Gabriel's going to go to Oklahoma. He played at UCF. The ball jumps out of his hand. He's a really good athlete. I think he's going to put up huge numbers. We've seen now in the last few years, the NFL is not so beholden that every quarterback needs to be Ben Roethlisberger's size. And this guy is shorter, but he is a dynamic athlete. I could see him really vaulting up a lot of draft boards. You know, if you want to say in terms of like I think CJ Stroud, people already know about him, obviously put up huge numbers, but he will be a guy who'll be draft eligible next year. I could see him being the top quarterback of the group. And then the wild card one to me is Will Levis at Kentucky. And he's got a huge arm. He's a big kid who can run, and he plays in a very intriguing system that the OC, Liam Cohen, came from working under Sean McVay and Kevin O'Connell. And they talking to coaches in the league, they thought this is one of the best play callers in college football. He's under the radar. A lot of people really are intrigued by Will Levis's talent. I mean, huge arm, 6'3", 230, can run. He had one weapon around him, like, you know, in terms of receivers, and that guy's moving on. But I think to see where he goes, because he really didn't have an off season. He transferred into Kentucky in the summer, hit the ground running, won over the team. I think he's one to keep an eye on.
Yeah, I mean, it's really what makes college so great is that, you know, every year there's that quarterback who just jumps up the board, right? It was Pickett this year, Wilson last year, Burrow the year before that. Like every year there's one guy who just takes over and ends up being a high top pick in the draft. Let's talk about the quarterback class that we have coming up here in April. You know, it's not as high end as the 2021 draft, but there are some intriguing names, and it feels like everyone in the NFL you talk to has it stacked differently. How do you stack up this quarterback class as the NFL season nears the end and people start looking into the offseason and the draft and as the combine nears as well?
I think the biggest boom or bust guy probably is Matt Corral from Ole Miss. He has a terrific arm. He's a really dynamic athlete. I know coaches that this came up in my story for Alabama and the reporting of it, who loved Matt Corral. They thought he was tough as heck. One of the coaches was like, I'd go to war with him any day. He just thinks he is so competitive. Now, there are some concerns, about earlier in his career, like has he matured a lot since then, or where he is with that. I think there's some people who see a little bit, feel like Zach Wilson, is he a one-year wonder? There were some bad picks in 2020 where he'd have 5 or 6 interception games. Talent-wise, I think he is different from the other guys. There's a quarterback out of Liberty, Malik Willis, who started his career at Auburn. If you've seen him in person, you're like, man, that guy looks like a linebacker. I mean, he has a cannon for an arm. He can run. He's still a little bit raw in some of the things he does. And he is inconsistent. I mean, developmental wise, I think he is going to be an interesting prospect for people. We mentioned Kenny Pickett. I think Kenny Pickett's really solid. I don't know, if you compared Kenny Pickett to maybe the other 2 guys, I don't know if skill set wise, he was quite as impressive, but I think he's further along in his development. Right. And so, I mean, it's going to be an interesting group. Then you get to like, there are guys, Carson Strong's arm is good. I don't know if it's great, but it's a good arm, but people are worried about his knee and his, like his mobility and that. So there are some guys who I think are a little, maybe weren't in the major college football, Saturday viewing, who are definitely been on the scouts radar for a while, but I think they really have to figure out what would we be getting with some of these guys. And I think that's where the vetting process is really kicking into high gear now.
Yep. And again, it's just the NFL right now. Everybody has these guys in a different slot. Like one team could be really high on Malik Willis. Other teams like, I don't see it. So it's not like last year where we knew there were 5 guys going probably in the top 20 and then going in the top 15. But this year it's really all over the map. I want to ask you about one specific quarterback that you didn't mention there before we wrap this up. It's Desmond Ridder. I mean, he's another fascinating conversation because again, there are some people who are super high on him, some who just aren't, specifically because of the accuracy issues. What is your opinion on the Cincinnati quarterback in the next level?
I think you hit on the last part. The accuracy issues, I think, are a little bit of a concern. He's developed into being a really good college quarterback. He can move. He's smart. He's got pretty good size. I think the accuracy concerns are something that may give people pause. I was surprised when I heard some people speculating he could be a top 5 pick or a top 10 pick. I don't know if, and I could be wrong, but I think even what you saw in the playoff game against Alabama, there were some opportunities there. They needed for him to be great to have a chance to be in that game. And he didn't have a great day. I think, like, again, Sam Howell from North Carolina, those are guys, I think a lot of people got a lot of hype going into the year. I'm not quite sure that they're going to end up as first round picks. They might, I could be wrong on that. But I think as the draft process comes away, it's going to be interesting to see how they get evaluated in this.
Yeah, and if I'm not mistaken, Ridder has trained with Jordan Palmer, if I'm correct, right?
He is, yeah. In fact, I did a big story a year ago that was really about Joe Burrow and Josh Allen's development. Yeah. It was around Jordan Palmer and those guys back in the summer, and Desmond Ridder was actually out there training with him.
Gotcha. Because Josh Allen, of course, coming in also had those accuracy issues, those questions coming in. And of course, look at him now. So Ridder is training with the same guy Josh Allen is, Jordan Palmer, Carson Palmer's brother. So we'll see how it all goes. It's going to be a fascinating topic here throughout the offseason, the quarterback carousel, not just the trade market, the free agency market, and of course, the draft class. All right, Bruce, this was awesome. Make sure you're all following Bruce on Twitter. It is at Bruce Feldman CFB. Bruce, I appreciate taking the time. Hopefully we'll do it again in the near future.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.